There is a question most people never say out loud, yet it quietly shapes their entire lives. Why does religion exist in the first place? Not whether it is right or wrong, good or bad, but why humans created it at all in the earliest days of history. This question reaches down to the very roots of human civilization. For something to have lasted for thousands of years, surviving wars, empires, revolutions, science, and social change, it must have been built on a powerful foundation. But that power wasn't divine, it was psychological. Religion didn't begin with divine revelation. It began with fear. Fear of death, fear of suffering, fear of the unknown. When early humans looked up at the night sky, they were filled with mystery. When their children died from disease, they were confronted with chaos. When floods destroyed crops or lightning struck from nowhere, they had no explanation. And the human mind cannot survive without answers, so it creates them if none exist. That's how the first gods appeared. They weren't gods of love or compassion. They were gods of weather, war, fertility, and death. Human attempts to explain suffering and to control what could never truly be controlled. A storm wasn't just a storm, it was an angry spirit. A drought wasn't random, it meant someone had sinned. Suddenly, the world no longer felt chaotic, it felt personal. And in that, people found a fragile sense of safety. Religion gave people more than explanations, it gave them hierarchy. In a small tribe, anyone who claimed to speak to the gods immediately gained influence. The shaman wasn't just a healer, he became the gatekeeper of divine will. And as societies expanded, that role grew with them. Priests, prophets, pharaohs, popes, those who spoke on behalf of the gods were no longer just storytellers. They became lawmakers. They became kings. Religion was the earliest form of social control. When written laws didn't yet exist, commandments filled the gap. When jails couldn't enforce order, eternal hells were invented. The fear of divine punishment did what no human authority could. It shaped behavior through invisible surveillance. God became the ultimate watcher, observing not only what you did, but even what you thought. And that was the real genius of it. Religion didn't only regulate outward behavior, it colonized the mind. If you could convince people their suffering had meaning, that obedience would be rewarded, that pain was noble, then you could control them without chains. You could make them love their prison. Martyrdom was turned into virtue. Guilt became worship. Submission became holiness. This system of belief wasn't always spread with malicious intent. In many cases, the people passing down these ideas genuinely believed them. They had to, because if their religion wasn't true, then their suffering was senseless, their sacrifices wasted, their gods silent. And silence is terrifying. So religion evolved. It adapted to survive. It absorbed local customs, rewrote old myths, renamed familiar deities. Christianity didn't erase paganism, it put on its clothes. Islam didn't invent morality from scratch, it borrowed heavily from systems that came before it. Every tradition recycled one powerful message. You are broken, but we have the cure. This is where religion shifted from being merely explanatory or political to something deeply psychological. It tapped into the most fragile parts of the human condition: guilt, fear of meaninglessness, and the longing for order in a chaotic world. Religion promised certainty where none existed, and it wrapped that promise in rituals, symbols, and stories that bypassed logic and spoke directly to emotion. Once religion became embedded in culture, it stopped needing to constantly justify itself. It began to sustain itself. Children born into a faith didn't choose it, they inherited it. And because questioning it was treated as taboo, religion developed a kind of immunity. You could doubt yourself. You could doubt your choices, but you could not doubt the sacred. This is how falsehoods survive. Not because they're always convincing, but because they're untouchable. Over time, religion became more than a set of beliefs. It became the foundation of identity. It wasn't just spiritual anymore. It became political, ethnic, national. To question someone's faith wasn't simply to challenge their ideas. It was to challenge their tribe, their community, their very sense of belonging. And so conflicts weren't just fought with weapons, but with gods. Crusades, jihads, inquisitions, all carried out under the banner of divine command. If your God was true, then every act in his name was holy, even violence, even murder. Religion didn't just justify wars, it also shaped everyday life by teaching people to accept their place, no matter how unfair it was. The poor were told they'd inherit heaven. Slaves were told to obey their masters. Women were told to serve their husbands. And those who suffered were told not to rebel, but to pray. This was one of religion's most devastating legacies. It taught people to accept injustice as destiny. The true origin of religion had nothing to do with fairness or morality. It had everything to do with survival. Early humans didn't create religion to oppress each other. They created it to survive the terror of their own awareness. The human brain had evolved just enough to recognize its own mortality, but not enough to accept it. So it created stories. Stories that blurred death into transition, chaos into plan, suffering into virtue. And once those stories became sacred, they carried a weight that went far beyond comfort. Stories becoming sacred, religion began not as doctrine, but as story. Early humans told tales around fires, stories shaped by fear, hope, and the desperate need to make sense of existence. These stories explained why storms came, why people died, and why the world felt so unpredictable. They weren't written down at first. They were oral traditions, passed from one generation to the next, changing slightly each time, growing more structured, more myth-like. When writing finally appeared, those stories were locked into scripture, and once something was written down and declared holy, it stopped being just a story. It became law. That was the turning point. Religion moved from being a comfort to being a system of control. A belief system that could no longer be questioned was no longer just belief. It was power. And power always finds ways to protect itself. Over centuries, religions built institutions, hierarchies, and rituals to guard their authority. And those who dared to challenge that authority were branded heretics, blasphemers, or infidels. Questioning wasn't just dangerous, it became punishable. Why? Because once people start asking hard questions, they begin to see that the authority of religion doesn't come from any divine source. It comes from tradition, repetition, and emotional conditioning. The feeling of sacredness is powerful, but it isn't proof of truth. It's a psychological response, something we are trained to feel. From childhood, people are taught what is holy and what is taboo. They learn to bow their heads, to whisper prayers, to feel awe in front of symbols. Over time, those feelings become automatic. They feel real, but they are learned reactions. That's why questioning religion feels so unsettling. It doesn't just challenge ideas, it disrupts emotions that have been deeply programmed since childhood. To many, it feels like an attack, even when the question is honest and sincere. But questioning isn't violence. Questioning is freedom. Freedom from guilt that was planted in you before you even understood it. Freedom from rules you never chose but were told to obey. Freedom from fears that were handed down as unquestionable truths. Religion was created to answer fear. Fear of death, fear of chaos, fear of being alone. But too often, it doesn't dissolve those fears. It feeds them. Think about how religion addresses fear. You fear death? Religion promises immortality, but only if you obey. You fear loneliness? Religion gives you a God who listens, but only if you pray the right way. You fear chaos? Religion provides a moral order, but one that punishes you if you dare to step outside its boundaries, even if what you're doing is guided by kindness, compassion, or reason. These aren't real answers. They're conditions, and conditions disguised as love are a form of emotional blackmail. This is the darker side of religion. Making obedience feel virtuous, making conformity feel moral, and making independent thought feel like betrayal. And it works. People don't defend religion because they've carefully examined it and found it flawless. They defend it because it has been woven into their identity. Pull on that thread, and they fear everything else in their lives might unravel. That fear is one of the strongest bonds religion has ever created. This is how you know religion is man-made, because it behaves just like every other human institution. It wants loyalty, it discourages dissent, it adapts whenever it's threatened, and it punishes those who walk away. That isn't the behavior of eternal truth. That's the behavior of an ideology. The difference is that religion reaches deeper than any other ideology. It starts training people when they're children, before they can even reason for themselves. It attaches moral value to belief itself, making faith seem like a virtue, and doubt seem like sin. And it builds fear around it, fear of hell, fear of exile, fear of losing love, family, and community. That isn't spiritual guidance. That's psychological conditioning. And yet, It's important to remember that most believers aren't acting out of cruelty. They are sincere. They genuinely believe they are helping others, saving souls, protecting truth. But sincerity doesn't equal truth. A person can be completely honest and still be wrong. And entire societies can be built on sincerity and still be deceived. This is what makes questioning religion so difficult. You're not just questioning an idea. You're questioning the emotional architecture of entire lives. Why questioning matters. And yet, this is exactly why religion must be questioned. If a belief system can't survive honest questions, then it doesn't deserve reverence. If it has to threaten eternal punishment to keep people faithful, that isn't love. That's coercion. If it can't tolerate curiosity, then it isn't a path to truth. It's a barrier to it. And if it tells you that your pain is part of some divine plan, that your doubts are sins, that your desire to understand is rebellion, then it isn't on your side. It isn't offering you freedom. It is demanding your submission. That's why religion was created, not to set people free, but to help them feel comfortable in their chains. But what happens when those chains begin to rust? What happens when people start to notice contradictions, when old explanations no longer work, when the mysteries of thunder, eclipses, and disease are no longer mysteries at all? That's when cracks begin to show. Every religion begins with authority, a book, a prophet, a revelation, something unquestionable, untouchable, sacred. But the problem with sacred stories is that they don't change. They stay frozen while the world moves on. Science advances. Knowledge grows, human understanding deepens, and the old stories that once felt powerful begin to sound outdated, contradictory, even absurd. Think about it. The same book that commands kindness might also command slavery. The same prophet who spoke of love may also have justified violence. The same God who is said to be merciful is also described as wrathful and jealous. These contradictions were easy to ignore when people had no alternatives. But now, with access to information, history, and reason, more and more people see the cracks. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. In the end, every belief system, no matter how ancient, no matter how sacred, should be open to questioning. If a belief collapses the moment you ask why, it was never truth, only control. If a God demands blind faith, maybe it's not God at all, but human fear dressed in divine clothing. The real strength is not in believing without doubt. It's in having the courage to doubt, to think, and to search honestly. Religions survive because people are afraid of letting go, afraid of being wrong, afraid of facing the silence of the unknown. But maybe the unknown isn't something to fear. It's the most honest place we can stand. A place where no one controls you with stories, where no voice claims to speak for eternity, where you are free to seek truth for yourself. So the question remains, will you keep clinging to the absurd just because others do, or will you dare to step into the unknown and find your own answers?